Hi everyone, welcome to the Whiteleyverse with me, Connor Whiteley, for another daily short story. Now, before I start today's story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you want to buy this short story and any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers and at your local bookstore and local library if you requested, and you can order paperback copies from Amazon. Now, here's today's short story. I hope you enjoyed just as much as I did writing it.
Crime Christmas Closet. Bettie English, private eye, opened her eyes only to realize she couldn't see. She even strained her eyes, forcing them to open as wide as she possibly could. It didn't matter. She could only see darkness. As she tried to move, Bettie felt something cover her skin, hold her tight and constrict her movements. She wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Knowing she was trapped for a moment, or the foreseeable future, she didn't know, Bettie pressed her back against the smooth, cold surface of something. For a moment Bettie wondered if it was even worth trying to guess where she was, but that's when she felt something. She hissed a little, as a headache corkscrewed across her head and sent a wave of pain over her. Bettie kept hissing for a few seconds before the headache passed, and Bettie knew something bad had happened. Breathing in the musty air of wherever she was, Bettie tried to focus on what she remembered. She couldn't. She felt as if there was something she was meant to remember, but she couldn't. The smell of mustard started to chip away at her concentration. It was so strong, so ugly, so awful. But Bettie smiled because even that was a clue of sorts. Lots of objects and places and perfumes didn't smell musty, so she just needed to figure what places did smell musty. Trying to ignore the awful smell, Bettie focused on everything else, but she was really focusing on sound. If she could hear something, music, cars, whatever, then she might be able to figure out where she was. After a few moments of listening, Bettie heard some Christmas songs, some children playing in the snow, maybe in the distance, and something else. Someone opening, searching and banging cupboards nearby. Bettie was sure they were all the clues she needed to figure out what was going on, but she hissed a little more, as the headache returned for a few moments. Taking a few deep breaths of the musty air, she tried to stretch her fingers in case she could feel something on the walls or maybe even a door or light switch. But her fingers were covered in something too. In some attempt to find out what she was covered in, Bettie rubbed her fingers as much as she could, which wasn't a lot, against the material, and Bettie frowned. She was sure she had concussion, but Bettie swore she was feeling tinsel or something. Bettie shook her head at the stupidity of her being tied up with Christmas decorations and tinsel no less, but as a private eye, she couldn't say she hadn't seen weird things. Pressing her head against the smooth cold wall, Bettie focused on remembering what had happened. She was a private eye, so she had to be here for a case. She just couldn't remember what case. It could be civil, kidnapping or theft for all Bettie knew. But a fragment of a memory reminded her about something. It was new, and Bettie hadn't done very many of these cases, but she had recently got her bounty hunter license. At first Bettie hadn't wanted to get it because no one uses bounty hunters in the UK, but Bettie always liked a challenge. But Bettie still felt as if there was something she was meant to remember. Something about what happened. Something, she just didn't know, but it felt important. She cocked her head, and felt something tinsel-like brush against her cheek, as she wondered if she was here as a bounty hunter. Bettie had no idea it was possible. Her boyfriend Graham had suggested a few targets for her, but she hadn't listened. She was too focused on relationship things whenever she spoke about it. She still wasn't sure if she wanted children like he did. The sound of opening, searching and banging cupboards nearby stopped, and now it sounded like someone was walking up some stairs. Then it hit Bettie, and she felt some sweat drip down her back, neck and hands as it dawned on her she was in a closet. It made sense to Bettie, and there were worse places to be tied up. She knew all about that from the time she was tied up in a car and driven around London. But this was something else. With sweat continuing to roll down her back, neck and hands, Bettie needed to think about what to do. If there was a dangerous bounty target walking up the stairs to finish her off, she had to be ready. She wished there was some light for her to see. Maybe she would have been able to see something sharp or something to break her tinsel prison with. Yet there was still no light. Pushing herself up, Betty pushed her weight forward, fell and landed on something soft. She was glad it wasn't something hard. Using her head, lips and cheeks, Betty managed to rather impressively, if she did say so herself, feel that it was probably some kind of mattress that someone had stuffed into the closet. Betty swore under her breath as she really wanted something to help break free. She didn't want to be tied up, constricted or someone's prisoner. She had to be free, and she had to solve the mystery of what happened to her. A part of her wondered if she had been gone long enough for Graham to come back from home, notice she was gone and start searching for her. But Betty remembered he was working late tonight, because of an operation with the French. The idea of her being gone for days briefly went through her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. Partly out of utter terror that it was true, and her friends and family couldn't find her, but she knew her family loved her too much to let her stay missing for so long. Especially her nephew. Rolling over on the mattress, Betty almost gagged as a massive whiff of mustard was kicked into the air. The lights turned on. Betty blinked rapidly, as her eyes adjusted to the bright light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Looking up, Betty's eyes narrowed on the little rectangular closet she was tied up in. She swore again, as she felt her blood boil at herself for letting some criminal get the better of her. Betty looked at the white walls, door and mattress in the closet, and wondered why someone wouldn't put more in here. It was almost like someone had either emptied it, or made it just to trap her. Her mind quickly started to come up with silly ideas about her being trapped by a serial killer, a trafficker, or a kidnapper. But Betty realized there was a much more pressing question. Why did the lights turn on? Betty looked at herself and nodded, as she saw she was tied up with blue, red and green tinsel that she hated. As much as Betty loved Christmas, she didn't like green tinsel. It wasn't an attractive color, and as for when her boyfriend got dressed up for Christmas, Betty made sure he didn't wear green. The sound of Christmas songs, children playing in the snow in the distance, and someone walking right outside the closet made Betty smile and her eyes narrow. She knew normal people would be scared in this moment, but Betty wasn't. She was excited, thrilled, ready for action. She needed to confront this criminal who dared trap her. Her plan was simple. Scream to scare the criminal. The door opened. Betty screamed. Someone else screamed. Jumping back, Betty wormed out of the closet. Climbing onto the other person. She head-butted them. Then she realized it was her nephew Sean. Betty instantly recognized him from his black designer jeans, smooth face and long white coat. As she stared wide-eyed at her nephew, she felt her stomach tighten and her spirit drop as she had just attacked her nephew. Her sister was going to shout at her, that was for sure, and as for his boyfriend Harry, Betty didn't even want to think about that. "Auntie, want to get off me?" Sean said. Betty rolled off him as she heard Sean get some scissors and cut her free. "What were you doing in a closet?" Sean asked, smiling. "I thought I would try it." "You know what being in a closet is like," Betty said. Sean playfully hit her head. "Seriously, Auntie? Mum's been worried sick," Sean said as he finished cutting. Betty smiled as she stretched and felt joints, muscles and bones pop as they moved for the first time in hours. "I don't know. Someone hit me from behind." "You don't remember, do you, Auntie?" Betty's eyebrows rose. "What?" "You got Harry to run a background check on a cop friend of Graham's. He sent you the results, and we didn't hear anything of you." "What's the time?" 6. Betty nodded as her memory started to return to her, and remembered it all. She met Detective Inspector Lawrence 2 days ago at some awards ceremony. The food was nasty, cheap and awful, so Betty didn't taste too much and Graham avoided it all. But when she met Lawrence, there was something about him, the way he spoke, moved and acted. It was strange, and then there was a rumor that Graham had mentioned in passing about him taking brides for politicians. At first Betty knew she was being paranoid, but there weren't any cases that she was working on, so she had the time. A quick internet search alone revealed a lot of good information about Lawrence. Lots of accusations, some evidence, no charges. Returning her attention back to Sean, Betty's eyes narrowed. "How did you find me? And who was banging the cupboards?" Sean looked to the floor. "I know you're with a cop, but you won't tell, would you?" Betty smiled and shook her head. She didn't really want to hear his next sentence. "Me and Harry pinged your phone." A part of Betty wanted to chastise him for doing something so illegal, but she could hardly talk these days. Betty just hoped her sister wouldn't find out. She would burn Betty alive for corrupting her son. "The cupboards?" Betty pressed. "What about the cupboards?" Betty's eyes narrowed. "Before you found me, I heard someone opening, searching and banging cupboards. Was that you?" Sean shook his head and they both smiled. If that was the criminal, then they had just made a very stupid mistake. There were plenty of cameras round the house, so Betty and Sean rushed out and went to find their criminal. Sitting on the cold brick wall outside the house she had just been trapped in, Betty looked up and down the snowy road that looked rather magical with the white snow against the black sky, as she wondered who had kidnapped her. It made sense for it to be Lawrence, but she needed proof. As Betty felt the cold wintry wind blow gently past, as Betty focused on all the semi-detached houses with their large drives and neatly arranged front gardens that were all covered in snow. Whilst she was waiting for Sean to come back with his laptop, Betty just sat there listening to the Christmas songs from inside the houses, children playing and the distant sounds of cars driving. Returning to a thought from earlier, Betty wondered if she was ever going to have children. She really didn't have anything else to think about. She loved Christmas with all the food, presents and family, but she wasn't sure if she wanted her own little family. Graham had spoken about it, but she wasn't sure. She loved her job, she was a private eye through and through, and Betty had seen the terrible things humans could do. So the idea of being a mum, it terrified her. The smell of the piney air and sound of Sean returning made Betty smile as she saw Sean walk up, sit next to her, and pass her a black laptop. She hoped the answers she needed would be on the security cameras, which she didn't have access to, but Graham did. And after one passionate night between them, Graham had given her his passwords for anything she might need. At first she had made sure to forget them so Graham would never get in trouble, but Graham had unofficially cleared it with his boss. The rule was as long as no one knew, Betty had results and she didn't interfere with cases, it was okay. Opening the laptop, Betty clicked on a few buttons, swiped the mouse and tried to ignore the cold numbness that was starting to infect her fingers. It didn't take long for her to access the security footage from a camera that looked at the house directly, and Betty played it, only to hear Sean laugh a little, as they watched Betty in her massive coat, thick trousers and messy hair go into the house. As much as she was tempted to give Sean a gentle elbow in the ribs, she knew he was right. From this camera angle she hardly looked attractive, and it was true. The camera definitely adds £10, or more likely £100 for Betty. Betty swiped the mouse a few more times as she fast-forwarded the footage, and there was no one there until Sean went into the house later on. Cocking her head, Betty tried to understand how this camera that had a wide open view of the house and most of the road didn't manage to see anyone come or go. "Auntie, any other cameras?" Betty looked at the choice of cameras that the police had access to, and there was only one other camera she could look at. She clicked on it, sped it up and smiled. After a few moments of looking, Betty found a tall man wearing nothing more than a tracksuit, a black hat and black boots. Betty stopped the footage and she zoomed in. "Isn't that?" Sean said. "Yes, it is." Betty recognized those boots, body and face anywhere. She never thought of Detective Inspector Lawrence as an attractive man, but Betty recognized his face anyway, and even his body was an odd shape, large in the chest, thin at the waist. All making it easy to identify on-camera footage. "What now, Auntie?" Betty opened her mouth but she wasn't sure. She saw snow was starting to fall once more so she knew she had to be quick. She didn't want Sean driving in a snowstorm. But what could she do? Betty knew she couldn't declare Lawrence guilty, because the footage showed him going into a house, and Betty didn't need to check again to know who owned it. It was his own house. But there was something odd about it all. Could Graham use the footage? Betty shook her head. I don't know, but if Lawrence is the man who attacked me, then... She remembered. Sean. I remember something about the man. I know it was a man for starters. He had... Betty said, as she did a circular motion on the back of her hands towards Sean. What? A tattoo? A burn? A cut? That was it. Yes, a cut. Quite large. I remember it from when he was tying me up. I must have regained consciousness for a few seconds. Sean nodded thoughtfully to himself. What? Betty asked. Sean took out his phone. In bed last night, me and Harry were looking at some of the pics from the ceremony. Betty went to nod, but she was a bit caught on the fact her nephew and his boyfriend were sleeping together. Shaking those thoughts away and breathing in more of the piney air, Betty took Sean's phone, looked at the ceremony's website and scrolled through the pictures. She knew it wasn't a perfect idea, as people only shook with their right hand, but it was the best idea she had. There were tons of photos. Betty had no idea that there was an official photographer. Then she remembered that skinny boy that was probably Lawrence's grandson taking photos. Betty shook her head. She would have thought the police would pay for a proper photographer for an official awards ceremony. Here, Sean stopped Betty scrolling and zoomed in on the photos of Lawrence shaking hands with the different police officers. Betty flicked through them, frowning, as in each photo Lawrence's right hand was clear. But there was one photo with an officer with a broken right arm, so Lawrence couldn't shake it. So he had to shake it with his left hand. Sean zoomed in. And we have it. Betty smiled as she took a screenshot of the photo, edited it with a red circle and sent it to Graham. There was a large cut in Lawrence's hand that was going to be his downfall. A few hours later, with her family talking, laughing and playing Christmas songs, Betty allowed the soft sofa to take her weight as she sat down. For a moment Betty just wanted a few seconds of peace, so she focused on the amazing smells of Christmas pudding, cake and mince pies. Her sister definitely knew how to make great mince pies. Betty could almost taste their sweet fruitiness on her tongue. Betty looked around at all her amazing family, from her tall, beautiful nephew who saved her, to her mini helper Harry, to her knight in shining armor, her beautiful Graham. They all sat on the sofa next to her, and talked and laughed with each other. Because it was that time of year. It was the time of year for laughing, loving and joy, and that's what they were doing here tonight. After what happened to Betty, everyone wanted to have a practice and excuse Christmas dinner with all the trimmings and everything. Betty still thought it was an awful fuss over her just because she got kidnapped again, and it was already past midnight. But then her nephew and sister reminded her that she was important to them, and she mattered. As she listened to everything going on around her, and tried to ignore the crashing, banging and bubbling of her sister in the kitchen, Betty stared at her beautiful Graham's face as she remembered how he told her about the official investigation that was launching into Lawrence, and if she was willing to testify. She was. And so that case was done. Betty wrapped her arms around her family and Graham as she knew she had proved Lawrence was corrupt, she had solved who kidnapped her, and most importantly she had got to have a Christmas dinner early with the people she loved. All because of a crime, Christmas and a closet.
Welcome back everyone, it's me again, Connor Whiteley. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's story, because I flat out love writing, creating stories and sharing them with you. If you really enjoyed today's story, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithms. And if you want to buy this short story or any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get them from your local library if you requested, and you can order the paperback copies from Amazon your local bookstore or local library if you request it. Lastly, if you want to support the channel on a one-off basis, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ConnorWhite. Also, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's story, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the channel. So, thanks for watching the Wiley Verse, and I'll see you again soon. Have a great day, everyone.